It started with King Arthur, and I was reading those King Arthur books, and which I'd got from the library, Cuma Monero Library, and sort of Knights of Camelot, and read the whole volume. And I think it was probably Roger Lancelin Green's King Arthur saga, who was one of the Inklings with J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I think it was probably his book in hardback format. Not 100% sure, but I think it was probably his stuff. Because I've got a copy of that book now, and the stories seem familiar. But that's where generally the roots, somewhat, of my interest in fantasy books came from. They were the roots which gave strength to the fact that I had an interest in the idea when it came along. I did not know about fantasy books, but I probably knew about Conan movies and things like that, so I had some sort of idea. But and I'd seen E.T., but that's mostly science fiction. But when a friend of the family, Jared Bryant, dumped a chunk of books in our collection, which he'd given to the family, and amongst them was some fantasy books, amongst other stuff, Conan's and a whole stack of things. And one of them was The Twilight Realm, and one of them was Porn and Prophecy by David Eddings. Twilight Realm by Christopher Carpenter, which I read and fell in love with fantasy. Then I read Porn and Prophecy, and I got the rest of the books from the library, and I was hooked on fantasy at that point. I was hooked. That was the thing, and I went off on over the next, I suppose, about nearly a decade reading fantasy and then science fiction as well. But very soon in the mid 1980s, as I'd started buying fantasy books from Percy's newsagents and other places in Cooma, I saw this book on the bookshelf, which was another fantasy book, quite obviously, which had a cover which really just appealed. It just, oh, that looks cool. It was thick, and I read the blurb on the front and the thing on the back, and I'd seen it a number of times before I finally got the finances to afford the thing. And that was Magician by Raymond Feist. Now, over the years, Magician has continued to perform well on the charts, and I think on the top 100 bestsellers of last year, New York Times bestsellers list, it still made the charts. Magician still made the top 100 for the sales for the year. Whether it makes it this year for 2020, who knows? But he's charted for a long time as Raymond Feist with his Magician book and his Riftwar cycle, which is like 30 odd volumes or something like that, all up. And it's come to its end now, the final volume, Magician's End, and there's been a sort of encyclopedia, um, Chronicles of Pug or something, whatever it is, a big Midkemire encyclopedia which he's put out as well. But it all began with Magician, and it was followed with Silverthorn and A Darkness at Sephonon. And that trilogy, which was actually Magician was in two books, uh, as 2 volumes in one book. So overall, although it's a trilogy, it's actually 4 volumes in 3 paperback books, and that's called the Riftwar Saga. The overall thing has come to be known as the Riftwar Cycle, but at the beginning of things, with the original trilogy, it was the Riftwar Saga. Magician, Silverthorn, and the Darkness at Sephonon. And that was really with David Eddings for the most part, and The Twilight Realm by Christopher Carpenter, and probably Piers Anthony Zam's, and what came in time, Hugh Cook's Chronicles of an Age of Darkness. They were the main fantasy books of my early years. I'd read others as well, but they're the ones which really did it for me. Now, Magician is about Pug, He's a young boy who's dancing along the shores of Cride, the seashore of a city outpost of Cride at the edge of the kingdom of Midkamaya. And the language there in that the storm had broken or however it starts, the language there in that first part of chapter one, it's it's to me it's just the same as in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. It's just as classical, the first scene of Pug on the seashore. It evokes imagery in my head, imagery which is still around of sunlight and ocean and wonder, I suppose. You notice, though, that like he does with his servant of the empire sort of stuff, mistress of the empire stuff, daughter of the empire stuff, a bit as well, that by the time we get into the second volume, volume one is called Pug and Tomas, volume two is Melamra and the Valaru, where they've grown to adulthood. It's gone from two young lads, Pug and Tomas, who are young in their teens, I suppose, and coming into manhood, towards a point where they're growing up. And throughout Magician, where we see Pug really show his strength, it goes from young innocence into pretty heavy stuff. And I think it's probably in the end, even though volume one is so classical in some ways, I suppose, or so touching. But it's the heaviness of Melamra and the Valaru which really made it so memorable to me personally. It was grand. It was grand. It was epic, and it was heavily dramatic. It was heavy. It was heavy. It's probably not as heavy as Stephen Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which is complicated reading, deep and heavy and complicated reading. But it was heavy. It was Magician. It was. It's not child's fantasy stories. But then again, younger readers, if they're smart enough, can read it. And I was only in my teens, and I appreciated most of it, I think. But it was very a real story. It wasn't like my Secret Seven adventures with Enid Blyton or my Free Investigators adventures with Alfred Hitchcock teaching the investigators this and that. It was much more complicated and much more, I suppose, grown up, but so such much more of a novel, such more complexity and deepness in it than there was in other things which I had read. It's fantasy. It says on its cover comparable to Tolkien at his best, or just what is it? I think that's the Feist one. That could be the Donaldson one. I give those two confused, but it's certainly there's a reason why Feist has been a big name since the 1980s. Harry Potter's been around since the very late 90s and doing very well on the charts, but Feist has been around that much longer, and there's a reason why he is on that chart and why those books are held in high esteem by quite a lot of people. Now, people who've read Magician probably know what I'm talking about in the sort of the epicness, I suppose, of what's going on there in Magician, the first volume. It's epic. It's grand. It's epic. It's very rich storytelling, very deep. I think is probably the word for want of a better word, or heavy. Intense, I think, is something. It's intense fantasy. I've read a fair bit of fantasy, and I don't think Feist is terribly cliched in what he does with his stories. He's usually got Lord of the Rings, I suppose, defined fantasy in many ways, but Magician doesn't really rip off Lord of the Rings ideas. It does its own business. It is original. Feist is original. David Eddings was original enough. Most of the big names, one thing about their works is that they were generally original. Their stories were original concepts. They weren't really ripping anybody off. They did their own thing in new ways. And I think looking back, Magician was an original work with concepts which hadn't been quite done in that way quite yet. I suppose if you went through history and culled all the fantasy books which are done and all the adventure and drama books which have been done, you'd find bits of him here and bits of him there, because Raymond would certainly have had influences upon his life. But Magician was original, it was deep, it was dramatic, it was intense, it was heavy, and it's just an epic book as Magician. Silverthorn was slightly shorter, but not quite as grand, but quite good as well. And A Darkness at Sephinon, I think, in the end, he pulled off a completion to what was, I suppose, a trilogy of books. Quite well enough indeed. But when it comes right down to the book, which is probably the classic overall in all of the Riftwar cycle, is indeed the first volume, Magician, and it's just a damn good book.